I have this theory that HIPAA is a scam. Okay, hot take.
Okay, love that.
Okay, here we go. I strongly believe that HIPAA was sold to us as this kind of protector of all evil of your healthcare information by companies that essentially don't want the data being opened up because then they lose money. And it's not about actually protecting us. And the idea is that I basically believe that if you ask anyone that's like 40 years and younger at least, if they would trade HIPAA for a level of convenience of care that you would expect from 2024, I believe everybody would sign that. Welcome back to another fabulous episode of the Healthcare Trailblazers Podcast. Excited to be sitting here today with a seemingly very young and very interesting healthcare entrepreneur doing some really great innovation in a really, really important space that absolutely needs a lot of innovation. So Troy Bannister. Troy is the CEO and founder, at least most recently, of Particle Health. And Troy, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
So, Troy, where'd you grow up and how did you get into healthcare?
So, was born in Los Angeles, moved to Seattle at a young age. I think I was two or three. So, grew up in Seattle on a small island just outside of the city. Went to University of Washington in the city, and then came out to the East Coast for grad school and have not been able to get back to the West Coast, although it is inevitable. It was actually in Seattle during college that I fell in love with healthcare. I signed up to be an EMT, just kind of for fun, and absolutely fell in love with medicine. So switched from business school to pre-med, did the MCATs, got into med school, went and absolutely hated it. Worst decision ever.
Okay, what did you hate most about it?
I mean, there's a lot of reasons I could get into. I think the number one reason was I recognized I was not necessarily going to be a happy doctor in the profession unless I was an emergency medical physician. I really, really was obsessed with emergency medicine. And when you kind of are sitting there and you're realizing that, first of all, the highest burnout rate of any subspecialty. And second of all, the chances of me becoming an ER doctor were relatively small just based on how matches work and all the programs. And so I thought, if I end up a primary care doc in Wisconsin, am I going to be happy? And my answer was definitively no, which then led me to the thought, is this really the right job for me? Am I in it for the right reasons? Or am I kind of fantasizing against what this really is? So I came to terms with it and I bailed.
Wow. Strong decision.
Yes. You can talk to my mom if you want to hear more about that.
Did she disown you?
No, she was very supportive, but it was
she's not a Jewish mom, you're saying?
She is actually.
Is she?
Yeah.
So you're like, not a doctor? What do you mean?
Yeah. So law school, right?
Yeah. So accounting? No,
yeah, right.
Nothing. What are you going to play with the internet? What are you going to do? That's fantastic. That's awesome. So what'd you do after that? I mean, did you have a point of, did you have a break? Did you have a point of self-reflection and kind of where am I going with this?
I still have this like infinite curiosity into health and biology and science. And so I ended up finishing my master's degree in biophysics. So I got something from my time, and from my loans I took out, which I'm still paying off in droves. So with that master's degree, I then I moved up to New York City where all my friends were moving, just because my friends were moving there, frankly. And I started working at Mount Sinai as a clinical research coordinator. And so I'd been doing research at University of Washington when I was in undergrad. So it wasn't a big jump for me to go pick up some more projects here in the city. And with my master's degree, I was able to get a little bit extra, cool stuff. So I did some interesting research, both at UW and at Mount Sinai, some boring stuff, didn't love it. And, during that time period, it was really just let's do something in the space that I love, but not necessarily the direct path I wanted to go on. And that's when I started learning a little bit about digital health. And, they're calling it mHealth at Mount Sinai for mobile health. And they're doing simple stuff like, what if we just set an automated text message reminder for patients to take their meds on time? And they did studies on that, and they showed that patients that were reminded to take their meds weren't going to the ER as much. And, if for the first time, right, as an EMT and going through med school and all this stuff, I was like, why have we never thought about using the internet or digital means for healthcare? It seems like a no-brainer. It's an untapped area. So I got really interested in the digital side of things around 2011 or so, 2012.
That's awesome. Wow. Okay. So when did you start? First of all, how old are you, for the record?
Let's see. I'm 34.
Wow. God bless. They should write a book on aging well.
Wow,
so,
that's good to hear.
The
camera here.
Yeah, no, you look 28. Okay, that's great. So when did you start Particle Health, and what is it?
Started Particle Health in 2018. The idea was, where's the Plaid or the Stripe or the Twilio for medical records in healthcare? Where's the one-stop shop? And it's been, that kind of framework has been used 1,000 times now by 1,000 different companies. We hear it all the time, but it's a good analogy. Right? Plaid was really a category defining kind of business model, API based, right? Really, really simple, behind the scenes. And their model is really smart. It's the infrastructure that companies can build on top of. And so Plaid doesn't have to compete with all the UI UX companies. They can have 5 different competing companies all using Plaid, and one wins, Plaid wins. So I like that model. I thought it was really smart. I mean, the unit economics are great. Everything's really good about that business. So from a business side, I was like, this is good. From a value proposition side, one of the most obvious things I had seen in healthcare, right? You show up at the hospital, you show up at the pharmacy, you're in the ambulance, you're downloading a healthcare app. Doesn't matter. They don't have access to your medical histories. Just straight up. We all know this. It's the thing we've complained about and moaned about for 20 years. Fax machines are still the number one way medical records are exchanged. Why?
Oh my God, I have so much to say on that. Whenever I get that request from like a biller, it's like, oh, can you fax this over? I'm like, sure. Let me just hop into my time machine, go back 20 years. I'll grab my fax machine, and we'll get that right over to you.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And it's still the status quo. It's getting chipped away at more and more aggressively every year. And some of these new rules that have just come out through the ONC, like anti-information blocking and TEFCA, are going to expedite that chipping away. But you still have companies like Ciox, right? If you're familiar with CIOX, one of the 50-plus-year-old company, they're doing fax machines of medical records. That's kind of their business model. Billions of dollars a year in revenue, right? Faxing our medical records. So it's still a core tenet of the healthcare world in the US. So long story short, business model is great. Value prop, we all know it's obvious. So how do we do this? And that's kind of the real big, the equation was strong.
Yeah. And so, okay. And are you able to connect to all the big EHRs?
Yes. Almost all of them.
That's crazy. So we got to talk about this, because I have this theory. That HIPAA is a scam. Okay, hot take.
Okay, love that.
Okay, here we go. I strongly believe that HIPAA was sold to us as this kind of protector of all evil of your healthcare information by companies that essentially don't want the data being opened up, because then they lose money. And it's not about actually protecting us. And the idea is that I basically believe that if you ask anyone that's like 40 years and younger, at least, if they would trade HIPAA for a level of convenience of care that you would expect from 2024, I believe everybody would sign that. Okay. And I'm going around and I'm talking about this to people, and the only pushback I get is from people that are indoctrinated with the thought that, like, what does that mean? Does that mean that if you Google me, you'll see my medical records? That's not okay. And it's like, obviously that's not what that means. And it's really interesting. I actually had a podcast guest recently, and she was saying how, well, if you take away HIPAA, then her example was how women are. She gave me some example about a woman whose medical
post-ops
history was leaked and ended up getting her in legal trouble with the whole story. And I basically turned to her and I said, well, let me ask you a question. If, first of all, that story happened with HIPAA in place, right? Yes. Okay. So HIPAA didn't protect that from happening. Second of all, if you are texting with your partner and I go and find those messages and put them out online, is that an invasion of privacy? Yes. Is that illegal? Absolutely. Right? So like, but at the same time, it is literally the most convenient thing to just pull out your phone and text your partner or video call them or whatever. Right? So why is there not a middle ground? Like my WhatsApp messages are supposedly triple encrypted. Like why is it not, you know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
but my point is that it's always been my understanding that this is an impossible nut to crack. And so how the hell are you doing it, man?
It's getting cracked. So do you know what the P in HIPAA stands for?
Privacy?
No. Everybody
Okay.
thinks privacy. It
Yeah.
stands for portability.
Okay.
The initial intent of HIPAA, well, there's kind of two pieces. The original reason HIPAA started in the first place was actually for health insurance coverage as people moved from job to job, where they wanted it to make it really easy for one employer to share information with another employer so that somebody could be covered by insurance. Because insurance companies were denying coverage of people when they were in between it. It's a weird little fact, but that was why HIPAA started. It was written such that data should be shared and exchanged between covered entities without any friction for treatment, payment, or operations purposes. TPO is what we refer to as. When you go outside of treatment, payment, operations, then you get into FTC world, right? These are apps, right? If an app is using when you sign a HIPAA authorization form and you're authorizing a third-party application that's not a covered entity, so not a provider or payer or clearinghouse to use your medical records, you are taking it out of HIPAA and giving it to them. Now it's covered by the FTC. Different rules, different game. This is why if you use a period tracking app and that data is now in some random application that you're using, it's not covered by HIPAA anymore. It's covered by the FTC. And it can be used by legal authorities should they want to use it to enforce something. So there's so this is to your point, right? There is now a gap. There is when this was written back in like the 70s and 80s, Clinton era, they weren't thinking about, the 2020s, 2030s, where we have this whole ecosystem of digital solutions and everybody's running clinical records across the internet. That was not a concept at the time. So we have this giant gap in between the paper record exchange world of HIPAA and the digital exchange world of the FTC. And there's no real good clarity from the ONC or the Office of Inspector General or anybody around how to do that. And so we run into this issue quite constantly where, I'll give you an example. On these large national networks, we are exchanging millions of records every month. And that's fine when a provider's requesting it. But what if I want to request my own record? Well, guess what? We get a 100% response rate when providers request their own record. We get a 0% response rate when you request your own record.
Yes.
Hospitals and EHRs flat out refuse to give you your record over the internet that way.
Craziest thing.
They just flat out refuse.
Okay, so this is okay. So let's jump to what you actually do and for whom you do it for, and then I'm going to try to bridge the gap in my brain as far as like what I know the reality is and what I've heard so many people complain about and how you got to where you are.
Okay, so I'll give you an example. We have a value-based care organization that has brick and mortar sites all over the country. They're within the ACO REACH program, so they are they're at-risk patients, right? And they're being handed, lists of patients every year that they have to go find, enroll, bring in, and manage. So they're fully at risk, fully capitated. So the way this works is they get an attribution list from CMS. Within that attribution list, they will then try to get these patients to sign up for an appointment to get them in for their enrollment, their onboarding. At that point, we pull that full medical record on that patient and we give it to that provider group. The provider group has individuals and software programs to look through those medical records for suspecting, for risk scores, for all sorts of things, measurements to understand of my population of patients, what's wrong with them? What do I need to know? How do I treat them? What do we have to do to not only treat them and have the best outcomes, but can then get paid for that treatment? So number one is finding conditions and risk scores and HCC codes to fully understand the risk. Number two is understanding what gaps in care that patient may have. So by looking at the complete medical record that we pulled, we can understand that patient did not get the eye exam or foot exam this year that we expected them to. So we need to get them in to do that. Or that patient did get that foot or eye exam somewhere else, so we don't need to get them in to come do that. So that, redundancy of testing and redundancy of diagnostics is eliminated. And then number three is actually tracking that patient prospectively and seeing, did anything else occur? Did that patient go and get a lab test outside of my purview? Were those results good or bad? What do I need to know now so that I can in a timely fashion, jump in front of this patient before they end up in the ER. And so that is really the core tenets of what we're able to serve up to a at-risk provider.
Okay, so you're hooked into their EHR, and you run all that data, and then you give them the insights, and then they tackle.
We're hooked into their EHR as well as pretty much every EHR in the country, right? So no matter where that patient goes in that health system or the health system across the street.
So that's the point, that because my understanding is, and maybe it's totally wrong, my understanding is that they make it really, really difficult, and maybe this is maybe it's just money, and exorbitantly expensive to make that happen. So
difficult, yes. Expensive, not necessarily. It's expensive in that it costs us a ton of money to build what we've built. We have to do integrations. We have to normalize the data. We have to manage all the endpoints. We have to standardize all the data that we get back. I mean, we've got Loin codes, Snowman codes, ICD codes. Epic has their own coding system. All the semantic normalization is completely off, right? Someone says acetaminophen. Someone says Tylenol. Diabetes type 2, diabetes mellitus type 2, DM2, DM type 2. Like, right? It's a mess. The data is a mess. So it's very expensive to take all the mess that's out there, string it all together, orchestrate it, clean it, and get it to a point where it's valuable to a customer. That's expensive. But
well, that makes sense. That's building out your product, which obviously is expensive. Like, I was talking to Athena, and they were basically saying that I would have to. Do you know what Commonwealth Health Alliance is?
That's one of our connections.
Yeah. So they were saying that, like, that. Yeah. And is okay. I thought it was crazy expensive. Anyway,
it is pretty expensive. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What I understand. That's really cool. Okay. So, and how long? And you told me right before we started recording that you recently what's the word I'm looking for? But anyway, you moved on from the
transition.
Role,
yes.
Yeah, transition. Thank you. From the role of CEO to, what'd you say? Chief of Strategy?
Yep, Chief Strategy Officer. Yep.
Okay, so how long were you CEO for and really running the place?
From day one, for 6 years, about 5.5 years, and then hired a new CEO who started about 6 months ago or so.
Wow. Okay, so talk me through that. Why, what, when, what?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So I think the biggest indicator, I have a great board. Everyone there is amazing. Some top investors from Menlo, from Canvas Ventures, really good people. Had a great relationship with them. I think what ended up happening, which I think is, in retrospect, really, I think, insightful. The mission I started with at Particle was, can we build an API that can access everybody's medical records? We did it. Like, we have a 93% success rate in finding records across the country just using your name, date of birth, address, phone number, and gender. It's really working. What mission number 2 started to develop into is analytics, AI, data insight generation, building a platform at scale. And that was a new problem set for me. And so there's a fork in the road. Either go back to basics and from step 1, do it again, or bring somebody in that's done that, as an expert multiple times in the past. And I decided to pull in the expert. At that point, I didn't want to risk all the work and the effort and the energy I'd put into the business for 6 years. The ups and downs they're profound. And so I made that tough call with my board and with everybody else. And so we were able to find someone really strong to come in and do that. And yes, I definitely had to swallow the ego pill a bit, but I think the returns are we're giving Particle even greater shot of massive success.
So first of all, I don't think, I mean, you obviously don't, because you did it and you're proud of it, but I don't see it as a knock to the ego as well. Actually, when I see founders do that, it tells me that they are extraordinary in the sense that they're able to build something that's bigger than themselves. And a lot of people, their vision remains within the confines of what they're capable of. And so that's why they can never let go of the levers that need to be let go in order for the company to continue to move. And, I know some in 2023, this happened a couple of times with some multi-billion-dollar healthcare companies, where there was one in particular we could discuss offline, but there was one in particular that I'm thinking of that the CEO did not seem to know how to do that. And they went from 100 to 0, like that. And there's another one that I'm thinking of that I'm pretty close with. And they've done the opposite, where something that they've put, their entire lives into, and they're doing the same kind of move that you're doing. And I think it's really important. I think that it's indicative of your ability to build something that's bigger than you. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right?
I 100% agree with you. It's just incongruent with the mindset of a founder, right? Like, in order for you to be crazy enough to quit your job, start the business, and get it to a certain point, you have to be convinced that you are the guy or the gal. You have to be convinced of it. You have to be 100% confident in yourself, or else you're just never going to get, those extra 10% of the wins that you need to get there. And at some point, you have to then turn that switch off when it's time. That's the hard part of knowing when to flip that switch off, like in earnest, right? And truthfully switch it off, not just fabricated. That's the hardest part, I think.
Yeah. I hear you. I think a lot of people at your age and your stage of the company would probably sell the company and then, and rather than take a back seat or number 2 seat kind of thing.
Totally. Yeah.
Wouldn't there be an option to just bring in a VP of go the other way? And why did you choose to do that and not bring in a VP of AI or whatever?
We talked about that. We talked about hiring like a really experienced COO, but then at the end of the day, it was like, is this person just be calling most of these shots anyway? Right? Is this an inappropriate organization of org structure? It gets murky at that point, right? Why are you going to bring in somebody at number 2 that should potentially, be number 1? And then, and then there's everything in between. You bring in someone number 2 and then eventually they become number 1. That's an option. There's a lot of shades that you can talk through. At the end of the day, I think it's better just to pull the Band-Aid and make the move and make sure it works than flounder around with other options. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting mental exercise. I'm like,
oh yeah.
It's interesting. So
I gotta say, I'm way more relaxed now, so that's nice.
Yeah. Are you happy with
it? Oh God. Yeah, I think, it's always bittersweet, right? There's 100% bittersweet. I'm happy with the way things are going. I'm happy with the new CEO. I'm happy with my life these days. I just got engaged a couple weeks ago. Like, there's a lot of stuff for me to catch up on. Yeah, thank you. So like, there's definitely silver lining to stepping back for a bit.
Wow. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I go back to what I said earlier. I think it's a very young stage to be going through that. So that's awesome. So you've raised a bunch of money. I mean, this is a legit, full on, you've gone through a lot of the startup steps. You've raised money. So how did you go about that? This is your first startup, right?
Yeah.
So what was that journey like, getting to that point, going through it? What were some of the hardships?
Man, where do I start? I think
how'd you get your first meeting? How'd you get your first venture meeting?
Venture meeting. So I was working in venture before this, so it was relatively easy for me to pick up the phone. I think though the key is, I think VCs, as long as you have a compelling idea, it's not super generic or washed out or underdeveloped. As long as you have an interesting idea and hypothesis, VCs should be picking up the phone and talking to you, because that's a data point for them. Their job is to learn and understand the market, right? So as long as you have a mediocrely interesting, compelling argument to make, they should be picking up the phone. I think the first lesson I learned, and I think this is one that I tell everybody starting a new company in the VC side: if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. And so I leveraged VCs for advice for probably the first 6 months or so, where I was like, hey, can you do me a favor and just look at my deck and tell me what I'm missing? And then eventually that turns into, hey, we want you to come in and sit down with a partner, right? So you do that enough times, they guide you in the right direction. I think VC should not be your North Star, but they should be like your magnetic north, right? Magnetic north is not exactly north, but it's pretty close. And we use it for navigation all the time. That's what VC should be.
You fly?
Oh, no, definitely not. I was a Boy Scout, though. And so I think they're really good barometers, right? If you're on the right track or not, but they're not the definitive right or wrong. In fact, they're usually wrong about what is right, but they're close. They're oftentimes close. They're really good at pattern recognition. So I think VCs are underutilized in the early phases of building a company, where you can throw pitch deck after pitch deck at them and they'll tell you roughly where you are right and where you are wrong. And so I think it's an interesting, they're a valuable resource that's I think needs to be used more by entrepreneurs.
If you could do it over, because I'm discussing this a lot. I had actually another guy today that I chatted with. Also, he's on his sixth startup.
Jesus.
He sold 3 of them, failed at 3 of them. Well, he calls them lessons, which fantastic. And then I spoke to another woman today, also who has another health startup, but it's her first one. And her husband actually is a VC, so she also kind of has a similar to what you have, like kind of seeing both sides of the fence a little bit. And something that I've been focusing on is trying to be a second-time, first-time startup founder. And so,
okay, what does that mean?
So what that means is that I think that a lot of people on their first startup, they care about a lot of things that you find them not caring about in their second and third time. Things like funding, things like who led the round, things like amount of employees, things like fancy offices and really cool vibes and, that kind of thing. And I think that those are all really cool metrics. Those are the people think that they're important metrics, and then they learn that they're not necessarily. Obviously, in some instances they are. But my question to you is, you've done it. You did the funding. You've got the board. You've got the investors. What would your advice be to founders today? And granted, the market is also totally different. And so I think a lot of people are just focused on like, no, let me have a super lean team. Let me offshore as much talent as I possibly can, keep as much equity as I can, bootstrap as much as I can. What would your advice be to founders today? What's your framework around deciding whether to go with the funding route or
not? Yeah, I think you're raising an interesting point in that. I think, first of all, if you don't have to raise VC money, don't do it. Straight up. Way easier said than done, of course. And if you want to be, and the problem is, I think if you want to be competitive, if you're in a competitive space, you have to get VC money to be competitive. You just have to go faster and bigger, or else you're going to lose. So it's hard to go the non-VC route in a competitive, high-value space. Just the problem. I think the model has changed a bit, where spend, grow is no longer the North Star. The North Star is now, what's your unit economics? What's your path to profitability? What's your margin? How do you get better and better in those things over a shorter period of time? Which I don't think any founders don't think about or talk about in their regular, internal meetings. I think typically where founders lose sight of that is at the scale phase, where they're like, okay, we've got something working. Now let's just pour gas on the fire. That model doesn't work anymore, really, unless you're really tight on your business, which just is really hard to do in a shorter time period, in the time periods we're thinking about in VC land. So that's the new thing, is let's start from the beginning under that front, and let's go incrementally as opposed to exponentially. So I think that's the second one. The third one, and this is one I think I underestimated the first time around, that I've been thinking a lot about more recently, is what is your, I think I use this word a little bit loosely, but your distribution plan, or your go-to-market is another kind of way to say it. I think we often just think like, oh, I'm just going to hire salespeople. We're going to go sell it. That isn't what I've found. Is the most successful companies don't go back to that. The most successful companies have something special designed in that area that allows them to either flywheel sell, or sell in a better way than just typical SaaS salespeople. That model in healthcare is just really, really expensive to do. And I've thought about that. And I think I often think of Redox. If you're familiar with Redox, they're another integration company. They're non-competitive with us. We like them a lot. Redox is at least they used to. I don't know if they've changed it too much, but if I was a startup selling to a hospital, once I sign that contract with the hospital, the next question is, okay, how are you going to implement this thing? And Redox would then get pulled into the conversation there. They'd get pulled in at the point of sale. So they didn't have any salespeople doing this, right? They would just get a call that says, hey, we want you to help us implement with this hospital. And then they would be part of the contract, and they would be baked into the contract. And so they every time, and then by the way, once they were implemented with that hospital, the next one would be easier. And then, it would be incremental costs from then on with that one hospital. Super smart flywheel model. And I think if you haven't thought extensively from the top to the bottom about that problem with your company and your go-to-market, you're going to just end up having a sales team, going and doing rote selling, which it does work. You can build a business that way. It's just not the way to scale a business necessarily. So I think about that third piece a lot these days. I think that is like the under considered segment where it's funny, even VCs are like, okay, you're going to just hire more salespeople. What's the unit economics there? You're like, okay, yeah, that's just not, I don't know. I don't know if that's a smart way to do it in healthcare.
Yeah. Sounds like sage advice to me.
Yeah, I don't know. But distribution's tough. I mean, EHRs own a lot of the distribution, right? Every hospital uses an EHR. So how do you sell through the EHR? That's got problems. Or you sell to the payer, right? Or how do you sell?
Systems. I mean, the systems that you're working with, it's very impressive to even be able to land those. I mean, healthcare is really, really notorious for being really difficult to sell in, because either you're selling to a doctor who typically sucks at business and also the decision maker split up between 3 different people, or you're selling to a massive enterprise, which once again, there's literally no telling who the right person is at the organization to even start the conversation with. It could be the
totally
event, you know, and
selling's really hard.
CEO, CFO, COO. So like,
it's really, really tough. And then it really comes down to like, are you hiring the right salespeople that have the little black book, you know? Yeah. And then, that's a hard one.
Gotcha. So what does 2024 look like for Troy?
I mean, Particle's poised to do really well this year, so I'm super excited to stay there. I'm also working on some stuff on the side too with my new time, which is nice. I believe I'll be launching another company, not as a CEO, but I'm working with a team to launch a company sometime in Q1 or Q2 this year, in the data space, healthcare data space, which I'm familiar with a little bit now. And then I'm also working with a VC to invest with them a little bit, a part-time role, but they'll have some side pod allotted for healthcare that I'll be working to deploy over the next year. So if you know any good startups in the seed Series A range, would love to talk to them.
Cool. Yeah, I do know a couple. Well, that is very cool. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I wish you tremendous luck in your 2024 endeavors, and excited to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. It was nice to meet you, and look forward to more chats.
Absolutely.